And thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's really an honor, and it's also scary to see all those familiar faces who I've been talking to most people in this room for the last 5 years about George Masa. So I hope I can teach you or talk to you about some things that you might not know about our friend, Mr. Masa. So I'm going to start with reading an excerpt from a letter that was sent to the Japanese ambassador in 1933. The letter was written by Glenn Naves, who worked for the Asheville newspaper. Honorable Sir, I'm going to have to remember that I have slides too, sorry. Honorable Sir, I send in this letter clippings from our morning and evening edition on the death and burial of my very dear and valued friend, George Masa, a native of your country. May I assure you that he was one of the finest and most noble characters I have ever known. His death has saddened me and has left a vacancy in Asheville that cannot be filled. The purpose of this letter is to interest some member of the legation in an effort, if possible, to locate the relatives or any relative, if any, that survived Mr. Masa. It is my opinion that if he left any relatives, that they reside in Japan. He was indeed a genius. His scenic photographs are masterpieces of camera art. Quiet and retiring in nature with most people, George was talkative with me and friendly and humorous, often in our conversation. In the South, we're very proud of the great outdoors area the United States government and the Rockefeller Foundation, with the help of the states of Tennessee and North Carolina, have created for us, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This was a project in an area dear to the heart of this little genius from Japan. It is so tragic that he died before its completion. He would have been so happy to have his beloved Smokies completed and finally designated and opened as a national park. So who was George Masa? Who was this little genius with a camera? And why were the Great Smoky Mountains a project near and dear to his heart? We found Glenn Naves' letter, the original letter to the ambassador, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo. We also learned that Naves' letter prompted a search by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police for any relative or relatives of George Masa. Although the police searched all the precincts of Tokyo, they searched Meiji University records, but they found no mention of anyone with the name of Masaharu Izuka, the Japanese name that Masa used in Asheville before going by George Masa as his professional name in the early 1920s. So 90 years later, my co-author, Paul Bonesteel, and I launched our own quest to find out more about George Masa. We didn't know if we'd be any better than the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, but we knew we had to try. And the results of our research is this book, George Masa, A Life Reimagined. So today I'm going to touch on how George Masa reimagined his life again and again. He reimagined his life in leaving Japan and coming to the United States in 1906. He reimagined it again in 1915 when he moved from the West Coast to the East. He reimagined his life when he was hired as an ironing man for the Grove Park Inn in 1915, and he reimagined that life and became a professional photographer because he worked like hell and he studied like hell, as he said, to become that professional photographer. Finally, he reimagined his life as a conservationist and as an advocate for the establishment of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the routing of the Appalachian Trail through the Smokies. Paul and I also had to reimagine the life we thought we knew. I had written a chapter on George Masa for the Kephart book, and Paul had done a documentary on George Masa 20 years ago that was broadcast on PBS. We thought we knew Masa's Asheville life pretty well, but we knew nothing about the first 30 years of his life, where he was born, who his parents were, how and why he came to the United States. So like Henry Louis Gates Jr., we set out to find out more about George Masa's roots. We were fortunate to be helped by a wonderful team of researchers in Japan and on the West Coast, led by a specialist in Japanese genealogy, Linda Harms Okazaki. We were also grateful to be the recipients of Cornell's Podell Endowment Award for Research and Scholarship, which allowed us to be able to hire the language expertise needed for this project. So today I'm going to take you down to Asheville, North Carolina, and to the Great Smoky Mountains in the national park that straddles North Carolina and Tennessee. At the end of my talk, I'd like to show you a short trailer that Paul did as a little advertisement for his next film. And it will take you, I think, on a little foray into Japan and the Pacific West Coast, and maybe be a little bit of a teaser for all the things I'm not going to talk about today. And after that, we'll head to some Q&A. So George Masa kept a small diary when he left the West Coast to come east. Some of his entries were written in Japanese, his native language, others in English. Masa seemed to move pretty comfortably between those two worlds. One of his first entries was, in English, launched on an adventure. Masa lived in Asheville for 18 years, from 1915 until his death at age 48 in 1933. Those 18 years coincided with an extraordinary time in history. The First World War erupted, and the US entered the fray in 1917. The country was on high alert, fearful of infiltrators and spies, and Masa's first boss in Asheville reported him to the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to today's FBI. The next year, the 1918 influenza swept through the world, causing at least 50 million deaths. Masa contracted the flu, but he was one of the lucky ones. He spent a week in the hospital and recovered. Membership in the Ku Klux Klan surged in the 1920s, and Masa, like many an immigrant, was targeted. A spate of anti-Asian legislation in the late teens and the early 20s ensured that he'd never be eligible for US citizenship. And while the US economy boomed in the 1920s, it plummeted during the Great Economic Depression of the 1930s. Masa was confronted with each one of these factors during the years he spent in Asheville, North Carolina. No doubt, he had launched himself on an incredible adventure. So on July 11th, 1915, the 30-year-old George Masa picked up his diary again and wrote another entry in kanji script. This is what he wrote. I visited the Grove Park Inn in Asheville at 11:50 a.m. and had an interview with the manager, Mr. Seeley, and the assistant manager. To make a long story short, they took me in. They are supposed to decide where to station me at 2 o'clock tomorrow. The hotel is huge, true to its claim to be the biggest in the world. Such an elaborate, magnificent building. It truly is. The picture doesn't even do it justice. Each one of those boulders is, bigger than this desk. It's extraordinarily beautiful. But the bosses determined that Masa would become an ironing man. And they sent him for a 2-week apprenticeship in downtown to a dry cleaning establishment to learn his trade. And although he started working in the laundry room, Masa was soon developing film for the wealthy guests at the hotel, soon leading them on hikes into the mountains, soon dreaming his own dreams. In his letter of resignation to Seeley, he wrote, as you know, am a student and imagine a great future, a castle of success. Masa, like millions of other immigrants, believed in the American dream. But Masa's decision to leave the Grove Park Inn prompted his boss, Fred Seeley, to report him to the Bureau of Investigation. Seeley wrote to his friend, who happened to be the head of the Bureau, a last guy, and this is what he wrote. He came here about 3 years ago, and for the last year and a half has been very active and very expert at photography. And he has maps of all the territory and spent all of his Sundays and spare time tramping and photographing. This Jap is about the slyest and most intelligent it has been my privilege to run into for some time. He is one of the most experienced photographers I know of and is thoroughly expert at map work and everything of that kind. The US had declared war on Germany in April 1917, but even before that, the country was wary and hyper alert to dangers both real and imagined. Masa's boss, Fred Seeley, was head of the American Protective League, which is a volunteer organization helping the Bureau. And its mandate was to root out and investigate anyone considered a threat to the US. Its aim was, and I quote here, enforce patriotism and stifle dissent. Although the initial emphasis was on German, Austrian, and Hungarian sympathizers, the APL applied its mandate broadly. Volunteers were urged to be on the lookout for suspicious behaviors in hotels, restaurants, railroads, and bus stations, as well as union shops. We don't have too much time today to talk about Masa's FBI file, but it was fascinating reading. Not because George Masa had done anything, but just because it reflects the extraordinary paranoia that was threaded throughout our country. And in this, actually, you'll see the main characters in that FBI file in this slide. But Masa and Vera Valentine Ward, who is a future movie star in this saga, had both left the Grove Park Inn to work for Giovanni Elia, the man pictured at the bottom of that screen. He was a wealthy Italian man whom Seeley and several other hotel managers believed was a German spy. You know, they didn't think his accent was quite right. They thought he was German instead of Italian. And right around this time, I should mention that the German Navy had actually sunk 4 ships off the coast of North Carolina. So it was, you know, and people were hypervigilant, but Giovanni Elia, we find out, is not German, but Italian. But from Seeley's perspective, all the ingredients were there for success. Masa and Ward were two valuable employees whom he had trained. They had abandoned their jobs. Elia was an engineer, and he had the technical skills. So Masa brought mapping and photography. Vera had been in charge of the telegrams at the Grove Park Inn, so she could man the communication through the Elia and the German U-boats. And Seeley wrote, "There's not the slightest doubt in my mind as to Mr. Elia's purpose, and I firmly believe he has communicated with U-boats and had a part in arranging their bases in Florida." But Elia was not a German spy. He was a celebrated Italian Navy officer and an inventor. Ward and Masa were not aiding the enemy, but simply working for Elia. The US Navy and the Bureau of Investigation concluded by writing that Elia was, quote, absolutely harmless, absolutely loyal, and is working for what he considers the benefit of the Allied cause, giving his own money and his own time to develop an invention for the suppression of the submarine menace. So Masa, after his stint working for Elia that summer, he came back to Asheville. But he didn't, as you can imagine, didn't go back to work at the Grove Park Inn. Instead, he did a short stint apprenticing for another photographer in Asheville. He soon, after this short stint, he opened his own business, Plateau Studios. And in 5 years, it's remarkable to me. I mean, in 5 years, Masa went from being an ironing man at the Grove Park Inn to opening his own studio. But soon after opening his own studio, however, A squad of policemen stormed the Plateau studio in the early morning hours of November 1921 and arrested Masa. One member of the arresting party happened to be a special agent with the police department, but also a Kliegel, a paid recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan. Historians classify three distinct periods of Klan activity. The first period, organized after the Civil War, concentrated on squelching through violence and intimidation the political, economic, and social aspirations of formerly enslaved people. The second period, centered in the 1920s, fashioned itself as, quote, the defender of Americanism and the conservator of Christian values. It was during this phase that the Klan membership went from 2,000 people to 2 million in 1926. And it's, according to historian Kenneth Jackson, there's also a third phase, as you might mention, or as you might imagine, that was reborn in the mid-20th century and continues today, focusing on white supremacy. But the second generation of Klan leadership broadened the scope from suppressing Black Americans to also targeting Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. And I'm quoting here from one of their publications. The time has now come when the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan should take the leadership in this great fight to prevent America from becoming the melting pot or dumping ground of the world for the millions of heterogeneous elements who are seeking admissions to our shore. It's not too difficult to see parallels with the Klan literature of the 20s and contemporary anti-immigrant rhetoric. So Masa was arrested for purportedly selling nude photographs of Asheville high school girls. His lawyer asserted that Masa, quote, absolutely and positively denies the statement and states through his counsel that he has never taken the picture of any high school girl except when dressed in a most becoming and most modest manner. That said statement is not only untrue, detrimental, and damaging to the character of this defendant, but it's a direct attack upon the purity and reputation of every girl pupil in the Asheville High School. It's a very complex case filled with heroes, villains, cowards, and victims. But one of my favorite heroes is a woman named Ann Davis, who was Masa's office assistant. She testified that she'd never seen any improper images of girls or girls in suggestive poses in Plateau studios. She also revealed that someone had tried to bribe her. She proudly asserted on the stand that she refused that offer and said, no, I don't make my living that way by telling lies. Yay, Ann Daves. So there was no evidence that Masa having taken any nude photographs of high school girls, but that accusation and those 2 weeks on trial had to have shaken his confidence. The Asheville newspaper was incredibly, the coverage of this case was extensive. And it reminded me of the same coverage that the New York World newspaper series had done for the Ku Klux Klan when they revealed the secrets of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Asheville Citizen used Masa's case to illustrate the racial bigotry and intimidation underpinning the KKK organization. The dangers weren't some abstract events happening elsewhere. The Klan was very much a part of the fabric of the city of Asheville, too. But Masa had his supporters in the classroom. Masa had his supporters in the courtroom. He had a whip-smart attorney who strongly defended him, prominent citizens who offered to go security for his bond, and a newspaper that covered the trial extensively for 2 weeks. The case also illustrated the power of a free press in covering local affairs, the courage of witnesses in refusing bribes, the destructive power of false narratives, and the strength of citizens in shaping the future of their communities. One of the attorneys asked, why would people support an organization whose main purpose was hatred? And this is a quote, what excuse for existing has this Ku Klux Klan? In the words of imperial wizard Colonel Simons, it's against Catholics, it's against Jews, it's against foreigners, and it's against Negroes. In the name of heaven, gentlemen, what is it for? So Asheville survived this ordeal, as did Masa and his business. Some of the same prominent citizens who might have covered Masa's bond in that trial became some of his biggest clients in the 1920s. The Vanderbilt family, and this is a picture of the Vanderbilt estate. The Vanderbilt family hired him to photograph not only their grounds, which were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, but also the interior of the Biltmore estate. The architect Douglas Ellington, who had just designed City Hall, asked Masa to photograph the City Hall for Architectural Record, which was his professional journal, the architect's professional journal. Harlan Kelsey, who was a prominent nurseryman and conservationist, hired Masa to photograph botanical illustrations. So from still photography, Masa moved into filmmaking, shooting footage for silent films and newsreels. Paramount asked him to film a Cherokee Fair. Warner Brothers recruited him for some Ripley's Believe It or Nots. And Masa offered his newsreels to most of the major distributors, Pathé, Universal Newsreel, Fox Movietone, for distribution. Masa had successfully reimagined his life. No longer an ironing man working for the Grove Park Inn, he was now the go-to photographer for a list of prominent citizens, who's who of prominent citizens. As Masa rightly asserted in a letter to a friend, he had indeed worked like hell, studied like hell, and got good reputation at present. But there's another side of Masa's photography, which I haven't touched on yet, and that's his landscape photography. In a letter to the Japanese ambassador, Naves wrote that Masa was indeed a genius. His scenic photographs are masterpieces of camera art. And Masa used these talents, his photography, his map making, and his trail knowledge for two important initiatives, as I mentioned, the establishment of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the completion of the Appalachian Trail. In 1916, when the National Park Service was established, all the national parks except for Acadia, and Dean's wearing a little Acadia t-shirt, right, or a sweatshirt right now, but all the other national parks were in the West, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Mount Rainier. In 1923, the first director of the National Park Service, Stephen Mather, said he'd like to see additional national parks east of the Mississippi. So a committee was established, and they developed 6 guidelines for a potential national park. The park should have mountain scenery to knock your socks off. It should be large enough to handle millions of visitors, have rich forests, flora and fauna, lots of streams to support camping and fishing, and be accessible by rail and road. So the committee was bombarded with suggestions from Alabama to West Virginia to North Carolina to Tennessee and Georgia. And one of those sites was the Smokies. We'll focus today on 2 friends who played important roles in the Smokies. And one was Horace Kephart, which I mentioned earlier, and the other one was George Masa. They became friends and hiking companions in the mid-1920s. Kephart was a writer and a conservationist whose books on camping, woodcraft, and the Southern Highlanders were national bestsellers. He became an influential advocate for the Smokies, writing letters, authoring brochures, giving speeches, and publishing articles about the importance of protecting the Smokies. Has anyone hiked in the Smokies? Yay, so you know what we're talking about here. The Great Smoky Mountains, I think we have a little slide here. The Great Smoky Mountains straddles the states of North Carolina and Tennessee, and it's 5,220,000 acres, is about evenly divided between those two states. It has everything that the Southern Appalachian National Park Committee was looking for. 16 mountain peaks over 6,000 feet, 2,900 miles of streams. It's one of the most biologically diverse parks, but ironically, one of the most heavily used as well. It has higher visitation than Yosemite, Yellowstone, and the Grand Canyon combined. So it is able to accommodate those millions of visitors. But today we also know the Smokies as a biodiversity hotspot. It was designated an international biosphere in 1976, a World Heritage Site in 1983, and scientists estimate that there are between 60 and 80,000 species in the park, but 65 to 75% of those species are still unknown. That this biodiversity hotspot was saved from destruction, protected from logging, mining, and development is really attributable to the men and the women who fought for the establishment of this national park. Masa was certainly a significant figure in this conservation effort, and he's considered one of the founders by the National Park Service. But for most of the country, the Smokies were terra incognita. There really weren't any roads into the Smokies at this time. It was an unknown and unexplored territory. Masa's photographs offered people a glimpse into what he was experiencing. Kephardt's words could be used to describe the Smokies, but Masa moved the audience in a different way. His photos were an invitation to walk into the landscape with him and be mesmerized in the process. The famous photographer Ansel Adams came to the Smokies and wrote that they were devilishly difficult to photograph. He spent a week in the Smokies and he made 47 images, but only 4 of his photographs were ever published. Masa captured thousands, published hundreds, and one contemporary wrote this description of Masa. Masa only weighed 115 pounds. I think I have another slide there. Masa only weighed 115 pounds, yet he had the fortitude to lug 60 pounds of camera equipment to heights too steep for ordinary, unencumbered persons to climb. An 8x10 view camera with a complete set of filters reposed in one carrying case. Another case held plate holders with a tripod strapped to the side. When a photographer drags equipment half his own body weight to a mountaintop, he shows a fairly serious interest in his art. So Masa sent his photographs to the governors of North Carolina and Tennessee. He sent them to Grace Coolidge, the First Lady. He sent them to officials in the national park. His landscape photography appeared in promotional pamphlets and newspapers and magazines such as National Geographic, Nature Magazine, and Scientific American. Once the Smokies were selected as a site for the national park, Masa worked with Kephardt on the North Carolina Nomenclature Committee. His landscape, I lost my place here, on the North Carolina Nomenclature Committee. Geographic nomenclature, the art and science of applying and clarifying names upon the landscape, is an important step in defining an area. It gives that entity a context within a larger whole. It facilitates map making and trail making. So nomenclatures, as I said, this area was really terra incognita. There were probably five streams called Big Creek and on the North Carolina side and just as many on the Tennessee side. And also there were places on the state line that had different names depending on whether you lived in North Carolina or Tennessee. So nomenclature was an important concept of trying to figure out where this place was in order to make maps for for people to be able to use. So this is what Kephardt wrote about the nomenclature work. George and I put in a lot of work on the nomenclature of our side of the park area. George especially, for while I only interviewed old residents throughout the territory and studied old records and selected Indian names, he, the persevering little divil, labored long and earnestly on his maps. It's astonishing that a Jap, not even naturalized so far as I know, should have done all this exploring and photographing and mapping on his own hook without compensation, but at much expense to himself, out of sheer loyalty to the park idea and a fine sense of scenic values. He deserves a monument. Masa's other significant contribution related to the Appalachian Trail. The AT, a long-distance footpath that travels through 14 states from Maine to Georgia, or Georgia to Maine, depending on what direction you're going in. It's going to celebrate its centennial this year. Has anyone here hiked the Appalachian Trail? The whole thing? Anyone hiked the whole thing? Okay, who's hiked part of it? Oh my God, I only brought one prize, but more walk, less talk was one of George Masa's favorite expressions. So we're gonna have to see who's gonna get this, but I'm glad we have some AT travelers. Benton McCue, as anybody who knows anything about the Appalachian Trail might know, he actually proposed the AT as in the early 1920s. But it was the energy of Myron Avery and the area hiking clubs that actually transformed that vision into a long distance walking trail. In the mid-20s, the northern section of the trail was further along. We had the Appalachian Mountain Club and we had trail groups in North Carolina. But in the mid-20s, the trail was very undeveloped, particularly the southern portion. So George Masa not only re-energized the Asheville Hiking Club, but he also chaired the Trails Committee, which scouted, mapped, and measured the section of the club's territory, which, quote, followed the circuitous course of the state line and led over an interesting series of balds. Avery wrote that George Masa has done, quote, an extraordinary piece of work in going over the route to demonstrate the existence of trail all the way. He's even measured and prepared trail data. Avery asked him to show his maps and his photos at the national ATC meeting. Masa had a wall map in his studio that really was the visual reflection of all the hikes he had taken. And Lola Love, who was a newspaper reporter for one of the Asheville newspapers, interviewed Masa in 1929, and she wrote, "The map is his textbook. It's the visual expression of his plans and his dreams, which he has made for his work. The map brings to his mind the beauties of the journey which are past and unfolds before his eyes some of the wonders which he may expect on trips to come. If everything else were taken from him," he says, "there would still be contemplations and beauty enough, set free by that map, to fill all the days and to console him for whatever other losses there might have been." The losses were significant: a homeland, a family, a culture, Pacific Coast friends. But the mountains also helped Masa with a deeper need. The Smokies replenished his spirit. He wrote, "When I make these trips, things don't bother me. I just leave office, go into the woods, get fresh balsam air, then come back. No use to worry. May I am wrong, but good to me all the time." One of the things I find most fascinating and inspiring about George Masa is his spirit. Despite the avalanche of social, legal, economic obstacles, the KKK, the Bureau of Investigation, the influenza, the economic depression, Masa never seemed to succumb to despair or bitterness. His spirit, his mantra was, quote, "Believe me, my head is always up, never surrender." And I think that too became my inspiration in doing this project. Kephart wrote that Masa deserved a monument, and 30 years after his death, he got that recognition in Masa Knob, a 5,685-foot peak in the Smokies. He also got that recognition in a tiny lichen that's, a rare lichen, and it's in the Smokies, called Masa's Dots. Well, that's its English name. But one of the supporters for that monument, the Masa Knob Peak, declared that in naming a peak after Masa, it would inspire others. He wrote, "Because recognition, when clearly deserved, spurs others to high public services. I join those who appear before you in supporting this honor for George Masa. The good it can do will reach people around the world. It can say that all men are brothers when they work to preserve the beauty of nature." Barack Obama, former president of the United States, once said of Kephart and Masa, "They were ordinary Americans who devoted their lives to protecting the land they loved." That's what Horace Kephart and George Masa did. Two men, they met in the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. Each had moved there to start a new life. Horrified that their beloved wilderness was being clear-cut at a rate of 60 acres a day, Horace and George worked with other members of the community to get the land set aside. Stories like these remind us of what citizenship is all about. Glenn Naves wrote that George Masa was a modest man, shy and retiring with most people. And I don't believe that Masa could have imagined a US president celebrating his contributions to his adopted country 100 years later. In writing a biography, Paul and I hope that Masa's story will inspire your own story, that his perseverance and his spirit will bolster your own, that nature will be a place that enriches and perhaps replenishes your spirit. A book talk is challenging for an author. You grab a couple morsels, out of this book and hope that you've been able to sketch or reflect a life. But that the 30-minute portrait you create in a talk is sketchy. There's much I didn't talk to you about today. I didn't tell you anything about his early life in Japan. I didn't tell you about his life on the West Coast. I didn't say a word about his baseball career. He was a pretty good fielder. And I also didn't tell you about a cache of letters that were found after Paul did his film 20 years ago. The family that Masa had lived with, the May family, this was in the last years of his life, they had found and kept a collection of letters written in Japanese because they thought the script was pretty. And after Paul showed his film, they contacted him and told him about these letters. They were all written in Japanese. They told a very confusing story, and of course I don't have time to go into that today, but they really, we call them our Rosetta Stone. They really unlocked Masa's early life. So I do want to mention that both our book and our slideshow and the film are chock full of photographs. There's also a book back there that gives you some examples of Masa's pictures for the park that you might be interested in looking at. But we had many, whoops, these are all the things I didn't talk about. I forgot to show you that slide, but you can see there's a lot. There's a picture of him in his baseball uniform there. But in any case, we had the images in the book, the images in the slideshow, the images in the trailer that I'm going to show you in the movie. They came from a whole variety of different institutions, and we're incredibly grateful for the archivists and the family members who retained those and made sure that those were protected. And if we're lucky, we'll be able to watch Paul's trailer. And after this, there's Q&A.
In the summer of 1915, a young Japanese man arrived in Asheville, North Carolina, quickly moving from laundry work to becoming a brilliant photographer. Using his images, trail exploring, and deeply personal ambition to become a passionate advocate for conservation, helping to make Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the Appalachian Trail. Filmmaker Paul Bonesteel has researched the photographer for 25 years, making the documentary The Mystery of George Masa in 2002, leading to widespread interest, including a tribute by President Obama.
That's what Horace Kephart and George Masa did. This is a wonderful story.
But even with this attention, mysteries remained, and his true identity was unknown. Then a small cache of Masa's letters, written in Japanese, were discovered. With these cryptic documents as a key, Bonesteel and writer and researcher Janet McCue launched a new research effort with an international team, finally unlocking who Masa really was for a book biography in September 2024, and a Life Reimagined documentary film in 2025. In Asheville, Masa faced cultural collisions, suspicion, and intimidation by powerful forces, but achieves remarkable success and ultimately finds his clarity of purpose half a world away from his home. Fueled by Masa's stunning photography, striking cinematography, and anime recreations, A Life Reimagined tells an empowering immigrant story from a village in Japan to the Pacific Northwest, and then in the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains. The film thrives on the captivating interviews and cinema verite moments with a diverse cast of storytellers who have all succumbed to the allure of Masa. George Masa died in 1933, leaving behind thousands of photographs and just as many questions. But the full story, his true story, has never been told, because it was never fully known until now. A Life Reimagined, the George Masa story.
Yeah. I should mention there's popcorn in the back after that movie. So what am I doing again, Sean? With the mouse. Okay. So do we have any questions? Oh, Fred.
Yeah, like there's do you know who the little girl in the photograph was? There's a picture in the lower corner, and I thought it was Masa.
Yeah,
With a little girl.
Oh, yeah, well, Masa lived with the family, the Kreisman family in Asheville. And, you know, I like to think of them as, I'm sorry, I should do this too, right? As his sort of family away from home. There was another picture of George Masa in a little go-kart. I think that was in there, well, it's certainly in the book. And that was one of the Kreisman, that was in the Kreisman family album that they had kept. And so, you know, we sort of get this glimpse of a playful George Masa that, you know, that you don't see in his formal photographs. And that little girl was actually at the cemetery for his funeral. And she remembers a sea of black umbrellas. You know, it was a rainy day and there were hundreds of people there for his funeral. But, you know, that sea of black umbrellas was a really striking image for her and for me too. Thanks, Fred. Any other questions? Jenny. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to wait till the microphone gets back to the person. I'm not remembering any of the rules that I was trained on this morning or this afternoon.
There we go. Yeah, I have questions from the online audience. There's lots of congratulations and saying what a wonderful talk and wonderful biography.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you.
Also asking some questions. One is, I'm wondering what happened to all of Masa's negatives when he died.
That's a really good question, you know, and Paul has gone to many garage sales, hoping to find them. They were bought by another photographer who then moved to Florida, but nobody has really found any large cache. I mean, they've been all just sort of lucky finds. We do have his inventory when he died from his estate, and there's a person who's almost as, if not more dedicated to finding out about George Masa. Her name is Angeline Whitmer, and she's created a database of George Masa's photographs. It's really extraordinary because she took, she's contacted all these institutions and put up surrogates of the photographs that might be in all of those, many of those archives that we found, and created photo descriptions of each of those photos, and also where those things were published. She started in the midst of, sometime in the last 5 years, because she had contacted us about this idea. She's done a really good job. It's the George Masa photo database, but you'll get a real sense of the range of his work. And it's, we keep discovering new things. It's finding things that, that might have Plateau Studios on them or on the back stamped. It's a scavenger hunt to a certain degree.
I do have another question. It says, fantastic talk, Janet. Although I knew a bit about him through Kephart, I was surprised to hear that Masa had died so young. A few words maybe about how he left this earth at such a young age.
Yeah, I mean, he died, it's interesting too, because the coverage of his illness was also in the Asheville newspaper. And the book starts with a recollection of a woman named Barbara Ambler, who was a really good friend of his. I mean, she was a 20-year-old in the Asheville Hiking Club. And the night before, when he was he had been at home, but then his friends took him to the Buncombe County home because he was so sick. And he died of tuberculosis. But he asked the nurse to call her and asked her to come. And she lived 20 miles away. It was late. She decided she'd go the next day. And as a 93-year-old, she talks about what a regret she had, or what a regret she still has, that she had when she was 93. She's passed away since now. But he was very sick. Whether, it said on that newspaper that he died of influenza, but the death certificate says it was tuberculosis. But people didn't talk about tuberculosis. My grandfather had tuberculosis, but you didn't talk about it. And I suspect that's why the newspaper said it was influenza. But yeah, he was only 48 years old, much too young.
This was just a spectacular talk, Jen, and I'm so grateful. But it's also, I felt like I've been being teased because there's so much more I'd like to know. But one thing, and forgive me if you did mention this earlier, I'm curious about how he started photography at the very beginning.
Right.
Oh.
It's obviously he came with some photography skills. He came to Asheville with some photography skills. And when in that little diary, he sent away for some photography books to the Illinois School of Photography, which had a lot of international students in its school, enrolled in its school. So he clearly had an interest, and I don't know how much self-taught he was versus how much, formal education he had. We don't have a sense that he had a formal education in photography. All these little clues, like his family in Japan bought the property from a photographer in Japan, but, did they know anything about that? There's still mysteries about George Masa, and but certainly we keep uncovering things too. I can't do any teasers. I'll be in real trouble, but we keep learning new things.
Volume
Just
2 soon to come.
This was wonderful, fascinating.
Oh, thanks.
Somebody I knew nothing about. He clearly was remarkable on so many fronts. It seems as though his relationship with the rich and famous was probably important to protecting him in some way. I'm
Well, just
curious.
earning a living too.
Yes, to earn a living too. But I'm curious as to, do you know anything about how that came about?
Yeah, that's, I mean, he often took photographs sort of with the hopes that somebody might buy that. And, whether he took photographs, of the Vanderbilts before they, whether of their state before, before he was hired and sent them and, as a possibility that they might be interested. The Mr. Creasman, was a carpenter at the Vanderbilt estate. Masa, there's another photograph in the book. Masa was also we didn't go into another one of his talents, he was a carver. And he carved for Biltmore Industries. And there's a picture of him in the book with creating it was a nut bowl, but he's carving a squirrel on this nut bowl. So, there may have been, because he was known there, they saw his photography, but, he soon became the go-to photographer. People would write, I know of no other Smokies, no other pictures that are as good as sharp and as sharp as yours. Myron Avery asked him to come over to the Blue Ridge because we don't have any photographs as good as the ones you've done for the Smokies. So I suspect a lot of it was word of mouth, but luckily the boom years were in the 1920s, but then he's a photographer in the Depression, no jobs, but at that point, actually in the 1930s, early 1930s, the Vanderbilts were opening up the Biltmore estate to the public. They asked Masa to photograph the Biltmore estate. And I discovered, I sort of love this idea that San Francisco did its first exhibit on, the San Francisco Museum of Art did an exhibit on landscape architecture. And obviously Frederick Law Olmsted was featured in that exhibit, but it was Masa's photographs in the 1940s that were displayed in San Francisco. So, it's sort of coming full circle to him being celebrated, although there was no credit, of course, on it. They were talking about Frederick Law Olmsted, but it was George Masa's photographs that were there. We have proof from the Biltmore estate. Yeah, it's neat. As soon as the mic gets up to you, Margaret, then you'll be allowed to ask.
I know that you finished writing the book several months ago, and this movie's coming out. Are there going to be new things in the movie that you didn't know when you wrote the book?
You get me to do a spoiler alert. Yeah.
Oh, I don't want you to say specifics. You can say yes or no.
There'll be a few things, but I'm writing an article that has to be finished this weekend on for Smokies Life journal, which will be some of those new discoveries. And Francis is coming up this summer to talk about a second edition. So, things keep, and so some of those things, yes, will be in the movie.
Right.
So,
And one other thing, is it Steele? What was the name of his boss at the?
Seeley.
Seeley. And you don't have to say specifically, but what I'm remembering is that he also becomes a support of his, right?
Yes, he does.
Okay,
Yep,
that's another interesting thing.
We didn't have too much time to talk about Mr. Seeley's turn of mind, but, so he reports him to the Bureau of Investigation, not once, but twice. And then he hires him because he's such a good photographer. And he not only hires him, but he gives George Masa hand-me-down suits. And, George Masa in the late 1920s, early 1930s is asking, to borrow money from Seeley, because there is no money. Seeley writes and says, I don't have any money. Nobody's coming to my hotel either. It was not a easy time, but, to me, it's sort of just astounding to think of the same man who reported me to the Bureau of Investigation, is now my patron. But yep, so Seeley did have a turn. Actually.
Janet, when you were responding to Ellen's question about Masa's photography, I think in the front of the book, you have one of Masa's advertisements, which is so clever. If you could show that.
I don't know if anybody can see it, but you can see it in the back of the room, but it's, you know, let George do it. But I have to put my glasses on to read it, but it is very, and you know, it's fun. You can look, if you look at Ancestry, Cornell has a subscription to Ancestry. You can look at some of the old city directories, and they're fun because you can see his advertisements, you know, advertisements in various and in those city directories, and get some feel for, you know, George advertises everything that he can do. This one doesn't say all the, just says commercial still in motion. So he was, you know, very early on doing moving pictures as well. In fact, I ordered one of those Ripley, Warner Brothers put out the old Ripley's, believe it or not. So of course I had to order and see, you know, what Masa's work was for Ripley's, believe it or not. And, you know, he did Blowing Rock and also Eve's Monument. So it was just fun seeing, you know, because there aren't that many early, you know, early 20th century or early 1920s films that, you know, didn't disintegrate. But it was fun to see those.
So I know that we could talk all night with all kinds of questions for you, but
Jenny's
we're
gonna
going
cut
to
us
wind up. But I wanted to end here with not so much a question, but a comment from Martin that says, if Masa's evocative photographs were crucial in establishing the Smokies in the American imagination, your and Paul's words do an equally wonderful job about recalling this wonderful man's life. Thank you.
Oh, nice.